Ideal mesmo para o mundo atual seria fazer o ensino médio junto com o curso técnico, certo? É no Senac que o aluno tem autonomia de verdade, formação cidadã, foco na diversidade, preparação para o Enem, material didático sem taxas e muito mais. Na real, tem tudo que você precisa para se sentir preparado para a vida. Seja para entrar no mundo do trabalho ou te ajudar a decidir o que fazer na faculdade. Quer saber? Senac. Vem comigo. Acesse sp.senac.br/ensino-médio-técnico.
Tem um momento na carreira que precisamos dar um passo além. É hora de fazer uma pós-graduação. Só que muitas vezes o custo pesa no bolso, inviabilizando tudo. Com a pós-graduação do Senac, você não tem esse problema. Cursos com até 50% de desconto e muito mais tempo para pagar. TCC opcional, modelo flexível com aulas presenciais e online e alguns cursos com apenas 12 meses de duração. Não tem mais desculpa, hein? Saiba mais em sp.senac.br/pós-graduação.
Now, back to the Larry Kudlow Show.
So a little more about the Fed, which has become the great central planning economic agency. It wasn't supposed to be when it was founded over 100 years ago, but it seems to have gotten completely out of kilter. By the way, I'll say, before we talk to our guest, Judy Shelton, 92% of the political donations by the Fed Board of Governors staff went to Democrats in the last two elections. 92%. That doesn't sound like great independence to me. Anyway, we're going to talk to Judy Shelton, Independent Institute Senior Fellow. Her recent book is Good as Gold, How to Unleash the Power of Sound Money. So, Judy, by the way, just on that 92%, don't you find that troubling? That wasn't always the case. I want to add, if you go back, 10, 12, 15 years before, the contributions from the Fed were about even, Republicans and Democrats. But starting in 2016 and then 2020 and 2024, over 90% went to Democrats. There's something about that bothers me.
It should bother all Americans. This is presumably an independent, nonpartisan organization that talks a lot about the importance of diversity around the mahogany table at the Federal Reserve headquarters. And yet, if you were to say, how about let's have diversity in terms of political philosophy? How about your 300 research economists working for the Board of Governors should be evenly distributed, should look like America and be Republicans, independents, and Democrats? How about the financial reporters who cover the press conference that Chair Powell holds after every meeting of the FOMC? How about they represent America in terms of political philosophy? That's real diversity, not this artificial stuff of skin color or gender. It's very bothersome, and yet I think you would find great resistance, especially from those 90% registered Democrat economic researchers at the Fed, to the very idea.
Yeah, I want to add, it's there are several Republican appointees on the 7-person board of governors, okay? But we're talking about the entire board staff, as you say. I think it's probably more than 300. But whatever the number is, it's the staff we're really talking about, not just a couple of Fed governors. So that is quite concerning.
Right. It's the ones at headquarters. Throughout the system, you're right. There's more than twice that many. But just in D.C., the ones who are the choreographers for the discussion that takes place 8 times a year to decide what should be the cost of capital in a free market economy. These are the same people who will model for the Fed the impact of the incoming Trump administration's pro-growth economic agenda.
And what do you think that's going to look like?
Sure, of course, it's going to look like Paul Krugman or Jason Furman designed the model.
Listen, Jason's not the worst. Krugman is. The ones that scare me are the 20 Nobel Prize winners who said that the COVID Act of 2021 in March was not going to be inflationary, but that Donald Trump's policies of lower taxes and regulations and oil drilling will be inflationary.
They were 1,000% wrong. And they're so eager to sign letters and proclamations. It's that exact kind of hubris is the reason that we've gotten into so much trouble and had the highest inflation in 40 years.
So your recent piece in the Wall Street Journal, Trump should challenge the Fed's policies. I just want to read, because I think this is the money paragraph. Why are there no limits on how much U.S. Treasury debt the Fed can purchase? No limits on how much money it can print. No limits on the interest it can pay at taxpayer expense to commercial banks on their accounts held at the Fed, and why there are no rules safeguarding the long-term integrity of the dollar while the Fed pursues its target of 2% inflation. I mean, I think that's, very important. No limits, no rules, certainly no particular worry about the value of our money in any lasting sense, commodity sense, gold sense. All that's gone, I mean, you go back, it wasn't always so. It wasn't always the case. I think the worst of it came after the financial crash. On the whole, Judy, I thought the Reagan years were pretty good with Wayne Angell and Manley Johnson and Walter Heller. And I thought Alan Greenspan was pretty darn good, not particularly his last term, but the earlier terms. And yet they've completely gone, hog wild in the last 10 years or so, 15 years. What do you make of it?
I think that the 2008 financial meltdown, a debacle that if we're going to assign blame, there was no other institution that should be held more responsible for properly calibrating the amount of money and credit in the system. That's why we give the Fed so much power, and they utterly blew it. But since those days, the Fed, instead of claiming responsibility or any kind of accountability, just started accumulating more powers. You're right, in the old days, like when Volcker was combating inflation,
yes,
he had to interact with markets. He did it through open market operations where banks had to communicate and decide how much they would keep in reserves overnight at the Fed. That's how you controlled the multiplier effect. But they don't do that anymore. Now it's more like what you started with the introduction, talking about the central planning aspect of our central bank. It became more Soviet-like in this sense that now the Fed officials decide what the interest rate will be by diktat. They call it administrative rates. And they basically coerce commercial banks who have to keep accounts at the Fed to keep the money sitting idle. They pay them so that it makes, from the bank's point of view, it makes more sense to let the money sit dormant that the Fed created by purchasing U.S. Treasury debt, let it sit there doing nothing, than to make loans to the private sector. So when the Fed has high rates, it's really empowering government, which doesn't care what interests are. Government will spend whatever it takes. But to the private sector, high borrowing costs can be a real obstacle to expanding plant and equipment, to hiring more people. And I would argue it's the supply side approach that President Trump is going to pursue that says access to capital, being able to borrow, is how you expand supply. That is the solution to inflation, not going back to restricting demand.
Judy Shelton, good as gold. How to unleash the power of sound money. Thank you, Judy. We appreciate you right on these reforms. Folks, we'll break. And then General Jack Keane is going to help us understand Ukraine, Russia, and Israel.